North Carolina Republicans are going hard after state voting rights. Joining us to talk about it from North Carolina is the Reverend William Barber, president of the North Carolina NAACP, who was arrested yesterday at the State House. Here at the table, Myrna Perez of the Brennan Center for Justice and Ben Jealous, president and CEO of the NAACP. Reverend, I'll begin with you. My first question for you is this. If a skeptical person looks at what's going on in North Carolina and says, look, this is why we had elections. We had elections. The Republicans won. They won the governorship. They haven't had it since 1988. They've got all three branches of the state government for the first time in over, I believe, a century. And now you got to live with the consequences because that's the way democracy works. What do you say to them?
Well, first of all, thank you, Chris. I would say, first of all, that the reality is that's not how government is supposed to work, because even when you have a majority, you cannot violate the Constitution. And what we see in this group of legislators is that they are acting like they're the George Wallaces of the 21st century. They're engaging in a Southern strategy with a 21st century twist. You gave the litany of all of the policies that they are passing. 500,000 people will lose their Medicaid on January 1st, 2014. 165,000 unemployed workers will lose their unemployment benefits on July 1st of this year. And then the slew of voting rights attack, which not only violate, we believe, the 15th Amendment, the 24th Amendment, but also violate our state constitution, which has been in place 145 years. So a majority does not give you the authority to violate the Constitution. So what they're doing is they're passing unconstitutional and uncivil laws, and that's why there's so much passion. Black and white and Latino and young people, a woman in wheelchair, preachers who have been the first wave of our continuing strategy. This is not a beginning of mobilization for us. We brought 20,000 people to the legislature in February, 500 activists on the floor in March, and now we've said we're also going to engage not only in a legal strategy with people like Advancement Project and Southern Coalition, but also with the moral strategy, civil disobedience, and that's the first wave on Monday. There'll be another wave next week and another wave, because we will dramatize this shameful, hurtful, cruel, and unusual public policy that's going down in North Carolina.
How much is North Carolina? I mean, the more that I read about North Carolina, the more I just couldn't believe what was going on in the state in terms of how aggressive the Republicans in power have been. It seems like...
But this is what we knew that Art Pope would do.
Right.
I mean, Art Pope,
explain who Art Pope is.
Yeah, you know, Art Pope is the Koch brothers Pope for the South, right? He is the one who founded AFP North Carolina, the one southern state to have a branch of the Koch brothers pack. But he also owns dollar stores, and he said, look, you cannot franchise my dollar store unless your community is at least a quarter black and 50% poor. Right. And he takes that money and he invests it right in right-wing think tanks. But the crazy part is all of that, and then he becomes the budget director.
Yeah, Art Pope has a lot of money. He seeds a lot of money into conservative think tanks and conservative causes. He is now the budget director in the state of North Carolina for the governor, as it would be as if Scott Walker just turned around and said to Charles Koch, hey, just come work in my government.
I mean, precisely that, except for a Charles Koch who, frankly, had a lot of free time on his hands. Right. Because this is the guy who, 2 years ago, Reverend Barber was fighting him because he set the agenda for the Republicans in the state. Number one was eviscerating the state law that blocks the state from funding the resegregation of its schools. Right. Number two was voter ID. And so you have this guy who's pulling all these strings who's also the state budget director.
Right, and I mean, what's really important to remember is how much North Carolina is in fact an outlier and how much it is out of step. If you look at what state legislatures across the country are doing, certainly there are some that are introducing restrictive legislation, but the vast majority of the voting bills that have been introduced are progressive. They're
is that
expansive.
true?
It is. There's more than 200 pieces, or close to 200 pieces of legislation in more than 45 states that have been introduced, and we're already seeing some of them pass, like in New Mexico. They're debating a very expansive bill in Colorado right at this moment. And when you have an attack like what's going on in North Carolina that is so expansive and is so widespread, it's going to affect students, it's going to affect people of color, it's going to affect poor people, it's going to affect people with criminal convictions. You have to ask, what are people doing?
But also, this is not, I mean, let's be really clear. There are two very different currents happening at the same time in this country, right? I mean, we've won huge victories, you know, that have pushed voting rights forward in recent weeks. We've also had huge setbacks, like Virginia, who essentially killed voter ID last year, adopting a very strict voter ID law this year. This is a civil war of sorts that's playing out in politics in this country.
But it's one that we
Chris,
win, though.
Can I step in for a minute,
Please, Reverend.
Yeah, because what I think is important is you have to understand that what we see happening in North Carolina is a reaction to our success.
Right.
We built a coalition over the last few years, and that coalition of 100 branches of NAACP, 147 coalition partners like Southern Coalition Democracy, North Carolina, and others, we built this coalition and we won same-day registration, we won early voting, we won Sunday voting, we pushed forward with more funding for education, and it's almost as though that for these people represents a kind of a third reconstruction, and they're reacting to this now because they know that with the dynamics in the state and the changing electorate, their time frame is limited.
Right.
Black people represent 25% of the electorate, 70% of black people voted in 2012, even in losing some ways, and 69% of North Carolinians. And with the changing electorate, the time of ultra-conservatism and the solid South is almost over. So this is a tyrannical power grab to try to stop a future that they cannot stop.
Is there a big regional difference that we're seeing in terms of the ways that these voting laws are going?
I mean, that's not the kind of difference that we see. What we do see are where there are places in the ground where people have been able to be successful in terms of using the courts. And one thing that I think we should all remember is that the kinds of laws that are being passed, especially the voting laws, are not favored well under the Voting Rights Act.
Right.
And it would be very, very difficult for a number of these laws to be able to demonstrate that it's not going to make minority voters worse off. And I wonder if cynically, perhaps some people are presuming that there's not going to be a Voting Rights Act to stop it.
Of course.
But in North Carolina, they also have to understand, and this is important for your national audience, 145 years ago, there were things placed in our state constitution. They are violating a states' rights. People are violating their state's constitution.
The state constitution. Myrna Perez, Ben Jealous, and in North Carolina, the Reverend William Barber. I'm glad you're out of prison today. That is